Hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Through Conversations podcast, the platform for the most brilliant minds. In this conversation, I'm joined by Charles Murray. Charles Murray has a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a BA in history from Harvard University. He currently holds the F.A. Hayek Emeritus Chair in Cultural Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. In his latest book, Human Diversity, The Biology of Gender, Race, and Class, he describes recent developments in genetics and neuroscience that are transforming the social sciences. In this conversation, we discuss his newest book, Human Diversity, in which he argues that advances in genetics and neuroscience are overthrowing an intellectual orthodoxy that has ruled the social sciences for decades. The core of this orthodoxy consists of three dogmas. Gender is a social construct, race is a social construct, and class is a function of privilege. Human diversity posits that all three dogmas are half-truths that have stifled progress in our understanding of the social, political, and economic worlds we live in. This topic is one that is highly contested and has become the kind of conversation that gets heated always, or ends up with someone getting cancelled by someone who disagrees with the ideas that were said on public record. Even though it is not necessary, I feel that I must state the obvious, at least for those who have been listening to this podcast for the past year. I don't have an agenda in this podcast other than being curious, genuinely curious, about my nature, our nature, about what makes us us, and about who we are, what we can be, what have we been, and all that is in between us and the cosmos. That, of course, must include our biology. In order to keep this show's statement of purpose truthful, I decided to interview three different brilliant minds who are experts in the conversation around the three orthodoxies that are being disputed by Charles Murray in his most recent book, Human Diversity. That is why next week I'll be speaking with Angela Saini, author of Superior, and her position is that race is indeed a social construct. Afterwards, I'll be talking with Dr. Dalton Conley, author of The Genome Factor, who, for me, offered a more central approach to this conversation. I hope that this mini-series of episodes that will tackle the conversation around our nature as human beings will amplify your perspective on who we are, and more importantly, will make you curious so you can interact with all sides of the conversation, rather than only accepting the one that fits with your worldview. Enjoy. I'm here with Dr. Charles Murray, the author of Human Diversity, The Biology of Sex, Race, and Class. And we're having this conversation in a time different than expected when we contacted each other. So the conversation around biology, the relationship within biology, and having the notion of understanding race as a social construct and biology, gender as a social construct and class as a social construct. How can we manage the conversation around these issues?
Well, with some people you cannot, because they are so resistant to any idea that biology plays a role that there's really not a dialogue possible. In the case of sex and gender, it's easier than in the case of race. And it's easier because, let's face it, men and women are biologically different. Nobody has any question about that. There's a thing called the Y chromosome. There's the obvious differences in genitalia and that sort of thing. And so it is not such a big stretch for people to consider the data about differences between the sexes that go to personality and cognitive repertoires, which is the phrase I use to cover not just IQ, but a wide variety of ways in which we interact with the world using our mind, and social behavior. So there is an opening there for people who are willing to give it a chance. And And, in a way, there's strategies you have to use. And I'm happy to use them. One of them is try to avoid things where clearly there's one behavior or personality trait or cognitive trait that seems to be better than another, and try to avoid making a case for a sex difference in those, not because they don't sometimes exist, but here's the broad statement that is true, that even though there are positive characteristics on which women are better than men and the vice versa, men are better than women, they don't add up to a superior sex and an inferior sex. So it's absolutely true to say, you know what, they're different, but you can't rank them better and worse. So that's just a strategic thing. For example, on IQ, is there an argument about whether men on average have a higher IQ than women? Yes, there is a technical argument. It's very complicated. It's very abstruse with all sorts of complex statistics that I have a hard time dealing with. But are we talking about a big difference, even if it exists? No. Mm-hmm. And so why bother to go? I put it in a footnote. I have a long footnote where I describe the sources and so forth. But I give it such a small role because it doesn't really make any difference. The more interesting things are ones in which it's very hard to say whether women or men are better off. Women have better social cognition than men. And I don't mean that in a touchy-feely, women have intuition better than men. No, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about the ability of women to understand what's going on in the mind of someone else, which is better than men, all right? So, by the same token, visual spatial skills, men have a decided advantage over women.
Yeah.
Okay, which of those is better? Which of those is more important? And the answer is it depends. Are we talking about engineering? Visual spatial skills are very useful for being a good engineer. Yeah. Are we talking about a good interrogator of criminal suspects? Well, being able to figure out other people is probably better for social cognition, in that makes women better at that than men. And you can go through and list all of these different things, and the reaction of the reader ought to be, well, that's interesting. Not, I'm angry because of what he's saying. Yeah.
Yeah. That's one. So your book, when I read it, Human Diversity, was filled with notes, like a record number of notes. And we're touching on proposition number 4, right? Which was, on average, women worldwide are more attracted to vocation centered on people and men to vocation centered on things. So it's the people things I mentioned, right? And wow. So, I mean, ideally speaking, and we will get to this as well, it's outside interventions, right? So we see that in egalitarian countries, the differences in vocations tend to amplify.
Yes.
Which is kind of counterintuitive in thinking the expectation wasn't that when the policy was created, right? So how is this taken for people when we see in outside interventions stating that, we're trying to make a more equal space, and then women tend to go with more people and men tend to go with more things. And how is this?
Well, let me start out with the specific example, and then we can extend it to some others. For example, there's a higher proportion of women going into STEM in a country like Pakistan, STEM meaning scientific, technical, engineering, and mathematics, than in a country like Norway and Sweden.
Yeah.
Well, consider for a minute. If you come from a country which is generally poor, it has fewer really good paying jobs, you are a woman who has the ability to become an engineer. You may very well become an engineer, not because you particularly like it, but because good paying jobs are scarce, and that's where they are. So you become an engineer. You're a woman in Sweden with the ability to be an engineer, but your real preferences are for something else. You are freer not to be an engineer because there are plenty of other kinds of jobs that pay well. There's more economic security in Norway than there is in Pakistan, let's say. And so you go with what you prefer doing. And if there is a natural preference grounded in biology for women to prefer professions that deal with people, then you end up with more women going into STEM in a more traditional country with more traditional sex roles. But the reason this generalizes is it's not just choice of vocations. Personalities of men and women are more different in Scandinavian countries than they are in countries with very traditional sex roles. And this was a big surprise because the assumption going into the analysis for the standard feminist interpretation is a lot of these differences between male and female personalities are taught from birth. Women are supposed to be more nurturing. They're supposed to be more emotional. They're supposed to be this, that, and the other thing. And so once sex roles are equalized, these artificially inflated traits will diminish. And the same thing goes with men. Men will become less aggressive. They will become, they won't feel compelled to behave in a macho manner, etc. Well, it doesn't work that way. The differences between men and women in Sweden are broader than they are in sub-Saharan Africa, broader than they are in Asia, and so forth. And some people try to explain it as, well, it's still a function of the environment. Maybe women in Scandinavian countries are comparing themselves with other men when they talk about this, whereas women in less developed countries are comparing themselves with men. And they get to be very technical arguments. The simplest explanation is that in a country with greater gender equality, people are freer to do what they want to do. And that men and women do have different tendencies in both personality and in cognition, and they are freed up to behave that way.
Wow. And the implications in real life, right? So without acknowledging that these differences exist, first of all, going back to the statement that you said, that taking an approach with this information, with this book, with human diversity, that states this is interesting, opens a realm of conversation that just is without any, without any fear of saying things that are right. Stated by facts, I should say.
Yeah.
Rather than saying I'm afraid of going with this topic. In personally speaking, I feel that the whole civil discourse right now with what's happening does open, the door of fear is creeping more to have this kind of conversation. But I have to stressfully state that having an open mind about this, and it is astonishing to me, your book never mentions that these differences are equivalent to, say, superior or inferior. No. That's key.
That's what I have to emphasize, Alex. A great deal of the fear of talking about these things is grounded in the notion of the superiority-inferiority problem. And once you put that aside because it's truly not a problem, then it all becomes non-threatening. Now, mind you, given the things I've just said in the last 15 minutes, if I said those on a lot of university campuses, I would be driven off the campus because it's impermissible.
Yes,
but that's the age that we live in. It's not because these things are intrinsically frightening. And I have to say, there's another aspect of this. So much of what we're saying about the differences between men and women, people have known for centuries. They've known this for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And so now science is proving that women are naturally more nurturing of small children than men are.
Yeah.
The idea that this should be a surprise is ridiculous. And the idea that, this is only because women have been told that they're supposed to be nurturing, that's also ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, that's also a case where the real explanation for that is evolutionary psychology.
Yes.
Which I stay away from because the criticisms saying, oh, people make this stuff up about the evolutionary process to fit the way they want the story to come out. To me, let's take the women being more nurturing of infants. How is it that women pass their genes along? They pass them along through their children.
Mm-hmm.
Who bears the children and who has to keep them alive by feeding them during their first months? Women. If women don't do that, their genes do not get passed on. Males, on the other hand, they can sleep with a lot of women and have lots of different women who have babies. Some of them die, no big problem, because there can be lots and lots of women have a very limited number of children that they will ever bear. And guess what? Which women are more likely to pass their genes along? Women who love babies. And you're talking about millions of years of evolution that have produced sex differences in males and females in every mammal. And they all tend in the direction of the female being more nurturing of babies. Of course, that's true.
Yeah, definitely. And you set out the example in the book Human Diversity. You set out that, for example, if a female elephant wishes to have a baby, she needs to care for the baby. But the male has more opportunities to extend as the same thing that you said right now. Just
same thing.
Yeah.
A female elephant carries the elephant for the baby for 22 months, something like that. And then the baby has to be raised to maturity. You're talking a female elephant has very few chances to pass her genes on. She had better like babies. Yeah,
definitely. And so going back into the practical notion of these sex differences, there is this sense that without acknowledging that men tend to work in the field of things and women tend to work in the people side of the dimension, it's causing harm, like real tangible harm in, for example, the fields when we say that men and women don't have any sex differences, for example, in combat roles, or for example, it is difficult to get past on the notion that this is not to state that women cannot go into military, right?
No.
It does state that men have a tendency to be better.
To be better at killing total strangers than women are. Yes, that men are more aggressive.
Yeah,
they are more competitive in a lot of matters in which the idea of going into a situation where your job is to kill people you've never seen before. There are a variety of psychological reasons in which males it's easier for them to do that. Then you also have the question of close combat and frontline combat. You have some issues with the males there, because when the Israeli army, which badly needed to have everybody in the army and in combat roles, they had women in frontline combat many years ago. And the problem was that men have a very naturally protective response to women. Mm-hmm. And you could not train the males not to be protective of the women. And when they were protective of the women, combat efficiency fell. Now, this is the case of being practical. Is it possible to train males not to protect women? Yeah, for some men, it probably can be done. But how many? Is it possible that some women are just as competitive and are just as willing to go out and aggressively kill people as men? Yeah, some women are, but how many? And so if you're trying to put together a frontline infantry combat unit, which strategy is likely to produce a better combat unit? All males or a mix of males and females? And the contrast that I give in the book, I said, suppose instead you're talking about the crew of a warship. Mm-hmm. And the task on the warship is a team that's firing missiles at a target 100 miles away. Is there any reason that men and women can't be on the same team and do just as well? No, that would work fine. Mm-hmm. It's specific roles, specific abilities that are required for those roles that ought to shape our attitude towards something like women in combat.
Yes, yes, and it's as I said, it's difficult to navigate this conversation because if for example the military would state that men tend to do better in combat than women, it would be directly translated into, so you're saying that women cannot be good in war, right?
Yeah.
And beyond that idea is that it does have some consequences, not in terms of winning fights or having an efficient artillery response, right? But it does have an effect on how many soldiers get killed or how many civilians get killed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those kinds of aspects. And when this brings me more into the question of the going into the genes, the role in the genes. How do they play in the relationship between genes and environment and polygenic scores? So let me try to unfold all of the
All
ideas.
these things. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
So let's turn to what we're learning about genes that is going to change the social sciences a lot. Right now, we know and have known for decades that traits have a certain genetic component. And the basic tool for doing that has been twin studies.
Mhm.
Now, when I say twin studies, most people think of twins who are identical twins that are adopted into different families when they're born, and they compare them 30 years later. The twins have never met each other, and they're very similar in all sorts of ways. Okay, those are very interesting, and those studies are useful, but they have very small samples because identical twins are very seldom separated at birth. The much more powerful method is to compare fraternal twins and identical twins. Fraternal twins are just like any siblings. They share 50% of their genes. Identical twins, also called monozygotic twins, share 100% of their genes. So that mathematical difference, half of the genes shared, all of the genes shared, say that if you compare fraternal twins, and let's say, what's the correlation between their number of arrests, when they're adolescents, compared to the correlation between identical twins and their arrests? If one correlation is higher than the other, for identical twins it's higher, the only explanation for that can be genes, if you're talking about large samples, because they both have this, they're both born into the same family. Identical twins are, and fraternal twins are born. They have the same parenting, same socioeconomic status, and all that. So we've had estimates of how much heritability plays, role heritability plays, but we have not had a basis for knowing more specifically what any given child has in terms of tendency. And here's where we get to the new tool that is starting to be used that will become very important over the next decade. They're called polygenic scores. So we have known for a long time that IQ, we'll go back to the example of IQ is heritable at 50, 60%, something around there.
Wow.
But we have not known what genes are associated with IQ. We now have identified, we meaning geneticists, I'm not a geneticist, geneticists have now identified several hundred variants, genetic variants, that are associated with IQ. Well, suppose you know of those, let's say it's 500 variants, and there are, and here, Alex, I have to get into some technical details, but basically, think of it this way. A variant can be positive for IQ or not positive for IQ, so plus, minus, just think of it that way. And so you can take the 500 and say, what number of these 500 are plus for IQ? So in one person, you have 450 that are plus for IQ, another person, 150. Well, you can convert that into a score. And in effect, you are predicting what the IQ will be for that person. Now, right now, these scores are much less accurate than IQ tests. Much less accurate. If you have a child and you want to know what your child's IQ is, give them an IQ test. Don't get them a polygenic score. But Polygenic scores are going to get better and better as time goes on. And so you can create a polygenic score for IQ right now that can basically tell you a general prognosis for that person. As time goes on, that will get more precise. It will be more useful in a variety of ways as a social science tool for analysis. So that 10 years from now, actually sooner than that, but 10 years from now, you can have a sample of 1,000 children and you can analyze their IQs using scores that are completely unaffected by the environment. Now, that last sentence that I just gave is the subject of huge argument. What I mean by completely unaffected by the environment is this. You can take that polygenic score at birth. You can do a DNA swab on an infant who's just been born and get a polygenic score for IQ. You can take a 60-year-old and get a polygenic score for IQ. That will be the same whether you get it at infancy or 60 years old.
Wow.
And so in that sense, it's independent of the environment. But does the environment interact with the genes to create effects? Yeah, absolutely. So it's not that you will have, and I want to make sure people do not understand me too fast here. You are not going to have polygenic scores that determine how we categorize a person. But we will have a very powerful tool in which causation can only go in one direction. The environment does not affect the DNA. It's only that the DNA affects the environment. And that all by itself gives us a lot of leverage in all sorts of social science topics that we have not had in the past. So for the time being, it's going to be very useful to social scientists using large samples. It's not going to be much use for a parent who wants to know what their child's IQ is going to be. But it's useful to know this even for the individual. You're familiar with 23andMe?
Yes.
Yeah, I've sent in my DNA to 23andMe. Well, it turns out that they tell you what some of your disease susceptibilities are, and it turns out that I have 2 copies of a gene that's very strongly associated with a certain kind of eye disease. Well, I still only have a small chance of getting that. Mm. So in one sense, it didn't tell me very much, except I have a somewhat greater risk. Mm-hmm. But what did I do? I got hold of an eye specialist and went in and had an examination and said, well, since I have a greater genetic risk of this, is there anything I can do to lessen that risk? And in fact, there are a couple of things I can do. So it's already useful for that kind of step.
Yeah.
As long as people understand the test doesn't tell you you are going to get the disease. It doesn't tell you you are going to have a high IQ. It says you have tendencies in one direction or the other. That's all.
This is the biggest takeaway from this, is that these tests don't say that you're predisposed to a certain outcome in your life, but rather there's a probability into which those outcomes come. And one of the fields in social sciences, for example, that I just connecting it with a conversation that we're having in combat, for example, is how about we connect polygenic scores with PTSD accounts? So if people tend to have more prone to be more PTSD experiences or traumas during combat, will we be able to help them more? So it will open a realm of possibilities to have personalized testing, personalized policy creation, and also trying to level the playing field in a manner, because it is counterintuitive, right? So if we say that genes tend to make you go into this direction rather than this direction, it says that life is determined, there is no free will, we shouldn't do anything. And it's the opposite way. So it creates a possibility to help people. For example, going into the smoking example. So if we know that people, not everyone has the same tendency to become tobacco addicts, they shouldn't pay the same tax, right? That's a way of thinking about it. So
right.
This brings us to, in Proposition 10, you said that it'll be one of the most contentious one because it relates with outside interventions, right?
Yeah.
So the whole notion, for example,
we better tell them what Proposition 10 is. It says that can't remember the exact wording, but that outside interventions are very constrained in the effects they can have, very limited in the effects they can have.
That goes into, people who go into a field where, for example, government or institutional changes, they think that, and I myself think that we can create change, meaningful change, by intervening. And sometimes that is not the case. And how would you see the government take into account that, outside interventions can be better if we acknowledge them, that they're not as efficient as we thought?
Well, we already know how seldom outside interventions make much difference because people have been evaluating social programs for years. I mean, an obvious example is programs in the United States. We have lots of advocates for what are pre-K programs. Pre-K means pre-kindergarten programs for disadvantaged children, where they are you try to put them into a stimulating environment, better than their home environment for intellectual development, and also develop some of their social skills. Because the argument has been that, well, children from wealthy families read more books, they have more books read to them, they have better living conditions, better nutrition, and you're trying to intervene for disadvantaged children to bring them up. Okay? These programs have been very intensive. Many of them have been tried. They have been evaluated. And back in the 1960s, there were a couple of small programs that reported fabulous results, which have not been replicated since. The results have been very, very discouraging. Well, it turns out, and the more we learn about the role of genes, I think the more we will learn to accept this, that our ability to change people in large numbers through a bureaucratically administered program is very limited. Take, for example, the role of an inspired teacher. Many of us had an educational experience with one teacher that made a huge difference in our lives. So it's not that people can't make a difference in other people's lives. There is no way to have a program to provide children with brilliant teachers. There just isn't a way to do that. You can give money to give teachers more money, to raise their salaries. You can build better school buildings. You can't create that experience. The way that you change people is through individuals who are inspired, but also people who really want to change. And that's the key.
Wow.
So Alcoholics Anonymous is a successful program. Doesn't always work, but it often works. But it works for people who desperately have decided they need help. You can't assign an alcoholic to Alcoholics Anonymous and expect anything to happen. The person has to want to be there. And that's true of all kinds of things. In this instance, I ask my readers to say, let's not talk about alcoholics. Let's not talk about disadvantaged children. Just look at yourself and the ways that you have and have not been able to change. And I use the example of diets. Now, you're of an age where the last thing you need is a diet. Probably you need to gain weight, but
yes.
But as you get older, that will change. And so millions and millions of people are overweight, and millions and millions of people go on diets. And furthermore, they work a lot of times. People lose 30 pounds, 40 pounds. They look great. They say they feel great, and they do. Everything's going great, and they have made a change. But then 6 months later, they're back at their old weight again.
Yeah.
and you try to explain why it is, and you can, as you see why you yourself have not succeeded at diets, it makes it easier to understand why programs to improve people may have a short-term effect, but that short-term effect tends to go away, the way that human beings are. And that's why I think, and I'll make a political statement here, a great deal of liberal social policy for helping the disadvantaged is based on assumptions about how much we can change people's behavior permanently that are wrong. They are empirically wrong. And if that's the case, it's really time for us to have a social policy that accepts the differences among people and deals with them as they are, not as we want to mold them to be.
And this is deep within human flourishing, the notion that how can us maximize our time here on Earth? And these are, you mentioned 4 core values, for human flourishing: family, community, vocation, and faith. And we've seen, my generation as a 21-year-old has seen that faith has decreased. So how do you think how does human diversity play into these 4 fields: family, community, vocation, and faith?
Just a little background on that is that I've been thinking about and writing about this issue for a long time, going back 30 years, which is, how is it that human beings achieve deep and lasting satisfactions?
Yes.
I'm not talking about momentary pleasure. I'm not talking about a good meal, or a fun movie or anything. What are the things that last in terms of you look back on it and you're satisfied with what happened? And I'm saying there just aren't that many deals. Family is obviously one: children, spouse, siblings and relatives. Community, the local neighborhood in which you are, and vocation, what you do for a living, which, if you love it, can make a huge difference in your life and your satisfactions. Community, vocation, faith, and family. Yeah, those are basically the 4. What you want to do is say, how can we have a society in which everybody, no matter what their genetic background is, can have a chance of getting satisfactions from those? So if you look at it from that point of view, let's say that we have somebody who's been unlucky in the genetic lottery, and it is a lottery. Our genes we don't have any control over. And so they aren't particularly smart. They aren't beautiful. They aren't particularly charming. So they are not going to become rich or famous. What can they do? Well, I'll tell you what they can do. They can still be a good parent. They can still be a good neighbor. They can still take satisfaction at working hard at a job and doing it well. And they can also be engaged in a faith tradition that brings meaning to their lives. And those satisfactions are just as great for them as they are for somebody who's smart and beautiful and has all the luck in the genetic lottery. But what it means is, you don't have a social policy that says we're going to make this person smarter, we're going to make this person more beautiful, we're going to make this person more charming. You have a social policy that reinforces strong families, that reinforces vital communities that are quite active, that opens up opportunities for a wide range of jobs, not just being a lawyer or a physician or a business executive, but you have jobs in which people can be carpenters and plumbers and other jobs in which they can use their skills, become good at it, and take satisfaction from it. So you have a social policy that tries to strengthen the vitality of these institutions through which everybody can find a satisfying life. Back when I wrote with a man named Dick Herrnstein, a book called The Bell Curve, which is a long time ago, we referred to them as valued places. That everybody, whatever their abilities, needs to find a valued place, meaning that if you weren't there, you would be missed. And if you're a good parent and and spouse, you are missed if you're gone. If you're a good neighbor, you're missed if you aren't there. And that's what we meant by a valued place. So it's possible for everybody to pursue happiness. The way we have gone about social policy has been to say, oh, we need to give people more money. We need to give them more status and all that. And I'm saying, no, that's not really what we need to give them. We need to give them resources for spending their lives doing meaningful things.
Wow. And that's, we often forget about it. And in a macro scale, in an economy that enhances, the value of intellectual activities and programming and everything, it seems as if we're not doing enough to cherish this four cornerstone.
Yeah.
It is very strong to think about it, right? So
yeah, and in fact, one of the problems of people like us, who've gone to college and gotten advanced educations, and that is, we probably tend to spend too much time thinking about vocation, and not enough time thinking about family, community, and faith. And the example you gave about faith decreasing recently is a good example, because it's not that the new generation has carefully looked into and considered, let's say, the Christian faith, which is the predominant faith in the United States and in Mexico. It isn't that we carefully thought about it and said, no, I guess not. It's that they just really haven't paid much attention to that sort of thing. And so I think it'd be useful for those of us who are lucky in life, who have grown up with money and opportunities, to do a little more serious reflection on how it is that we are going to be happy in the long term.
Dr. Murray, as you can see, this for me is a conversation that is worth talking. I can spend a day long because I'm genuinely curious about it. And your book, Human Diversity, truly accomplishes what you set out to do, is that we should appreciate our biology rather than just closing the door to it. And I'll hope to keep in touch. And thank you so much for spending the time with me.
I've enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Alex.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in for this edition of Through Conversations podcast. If you find this episode interesting, don't miss out on new conversations, and subscribe to the podcast at any podcast feed you use, and leave me a review. Also, consider sharing it with someone you think can enjoy this episode. Our new awesome music is by Joe Lyle. More info can be found at joelyledrums.com. Hosted and produced by Alex Levy.